Hello and welcome to Silence, a podcast that gives women a chance to get honest and open about what it's really like surviving and thriving in what often feels like a male-dominated world. All of my guests have been handpicked from the fields of science, technology, engineering and mathematics, or STEM, where inclusivity and diversity can be a real issue. I know this only too well, having been a mechanical engineer myself for a number of years. I'm Dr. Shanice O'Mara, now a television broadcaster. I've worked on and reported on some cutting-edge technology and innovation over the years, and through my TV work, I've met some incredibly inspiring women from a diverse range of STEM fields. These women are true trailblazers, and I've often felt so empowered myself by learning what they're really like as people, usually when the TV cameras have been turned off and they're just being themselves. Each week on Silence, one of these women shares her unique experiences and truth without the usual pressure and stress of having to promote her accomplishments or uphold her impressive reputation. How? Well, because all of my guests are deliberately kept anonymous and disguised to ensure that we as listeners are not distracted or maybe even a little intimidated by all the usual kinds of societal labels and trophies. The women of STEM on this show have amazingly impressive CVs, but most importantly, they're human, just like the rest of us, and I want to share the inspiration and wisdom that I've gathered from them with you. It's my hope that you really relate to what we chat about today, and if so, please do subscribe to Silence and maybe even rate and review the show. I'd love to have your feedback. This week, my guest is in the field of data science. Hi.
Hello.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
How do you feel about this whole thing being anonymous? Is that weird for you, or are you used to it?
It's a little bit unusual. I do speak to the media quite a bit, and of course I'm quite passionate about the business I'm in, and also specifically around diversity in this industry. So I'm used to speaking to media, and I'm used to doing it as me, and sometimes also in order to specifically promote my work. So this is a bit unusual, but yes, hopefully that means I can also speak maybe more about the negative sides of our industry, which otherwise I might need to hide.
Right. Are there lots of negative sides?
Not lots. I love the industry I'm in, and I think it is a great industry for people of all genders and society to come and work in. And I would recommend it to anyone. But it is not void of problems and challenges, of course, and sometimes we can talk about them and sometimes not.
I mean, before we get into that, what exactly does a data scientist do?
A data scientist is typically an individual who looks at large data sets within companies. We are talking, there are three types of large or complications in this sense. We have actually large data sets, which consists of gigabytes, petabytes, terabytes of data, where you have to find some kind of signal. There are data sets that are diverse in the sense of you might want to combine numerical data with text data, for example. And then there's data that moves very rapidly, like Twitter feeds, for example, which are coming out at an incredibly high rate. If you want to analyze any of these to get value for the business you're in, you are typically a data scientist, and it means that you are applying computer science, programming, mathematics, statistics, machine learning, and generally problem solving and analytics to try to find some interesting pieces of information within that data.
Right. And is this something that you dreamed of doing when you were a child? I mean, I'm guessing that maybe when you were a kid, this kind of science didn't really exist.
No, I could never say that I really dreamed of this. And actually, I do come from a STEM background. My dream was actually to become a physicist. And since I was a teenager, I dreamt of becoming a physicist and becoming a scientist in general. And I did that. I did get a degree in science first before wanting to leave academia and try something else for a career, and that is how I ended up in data science.
So what about physics did you love when you were a child?
I think it was this idea of understanding how things worked. I was a very curious child, and I even have this distinct memory of when I was quite young, probably about 9 or 10, and my mother explained negative numbers to me, which completely blew my mind. The idea that there were numbers that were opposite to the positive numbers. And I remember trying to tell my friends about it, and they couldn't care less about it. But I think I've always had a curiosity to try to understand how things work. And physics was the ultimate way to try to understand how our world, how our universe functions.
Was your mum one of your inspirations then?
She is. She was not a scientist herself. She was an office worker, a white collar worker who built a good, solid middle class life for us. But she did value education, and she was a very strong woman. She brought me up on her own, and she also was involved in politics and other extracurricular matters where we lived. So she was a very strong woman, and of course, it showed to me that there were no boundaries for what you can do as a woman.
You mentioned earlier that when you were explaining negative numbers to your friends, they couldn't care less. I mean, was it really obvious from that young age that you were going to end up being in some kind of STEM field eventually?
I don't think so. Not until my teenage years when I really set my mind for it. But otherwise, I was the first one in my family to study a STEM subject. It was not really something you did. In my family, it was more about getting a career that would give you a decent salary and a safe job. So I was the first one to go for something like that. But again, I had a lot of support from my family. My mother was extremely proud of me when I got my degree. But I don't think it was necessarily obvious that was where I was going.
So why did you brave it into a subject where it wasn't really expected that a girl might study it?
I think it was a certain level of single-mindedness. So in those teenage years, when I started to become a little bit more independent in what I studied, what I was reading, and I started to read books about physics on my own. And school otherwise tended to bore me, so I would read on my own. And I just developed a passion for it. And as I said, from other role models in my family, I saw that you should do what you want to do. You should work for what you think you can do, and I think it just made a decision simply that I was going to become a physicist. It was, I can't really describe it. I guess it's in my nature to set myself goals and go for it.
Right. And so what was the kind of dream back then? Would you be working in a lab? Like, what did physicists
I was going
do?
to win the Nobel Prize, of course.
Oh, wow, ambitious.
Well, I also thought if you're going to do something, you should always try to be the best at it. And I mean, I can say this because it is anonymous, and it's typically not the kind of thing you would go out and tell people that you have that ambition.
Yeah.
But no, I was going to become a professor with time, and then I was going to win the Nobel Prize, of course.
And so how did you make that pivot into data science? Like, what lured you into that field instead?
Well, first of all, it was a realization that the academic life was not actually that I was not so suited for it personally, because I discovered that I did not enjoy the sort of hierarchy, and the career paths that are available to you within academia. Basically I wanted to get to that professorship, but I would have to spend 20 years working towards it, and I'm just simply quite an impatient person. So there were many things about academia that maybe took a little bit of that naive pleasure out of it once I was actually in it.
Yeah.
So first that was the realization of I'm actually not sure I enjoy this. And then the next one was, well, what can I do outside of academia, which was not very clear, as my type of research was not very applicable for industry. And so I discovered this thing called data science, where I could apply my programming skills, my analytical skills, but have the freedom to work in any type of company I wanted, and also to live wherever I wanted and basically have control of my own life in some sense.
It's interesting because you seem to have had, as you grew up, you seem to develop a stronger sense of who you are and what you want out of life. And your career decisions seem to have kind of run in parallel with that self-knowledge. I say that because I kind of had the opposite, where I studied mechanical engineering and then was really wanting to go for a job in industry because of the money and, you know, the ability to climb up within a company. But actually, my true heart is in research. I kind of wish I had stayed in academia.
There are all types of jobs and there's all types of people. And the one thing that I say to younger people today when they ask me for advice or my thoughts on the industry is that the most important thing is that, first of all, you yourself understand, what do you want? What makes you happy? What would make you jump out of bed Monday morning to get to work?
Right.
And then after that, look at, well, what kind of a job would allow me to do that? Life is too short, I think, to be unhappy. And especially as we spend so much of our time at work, that is a very critical component to our happiness. And so I see far too many people who are unhappy, but who either do not dare to change careers or just don't know what else is out there and how they can get it.
So what's your day job like? You know, why are you happy to jump out of bed on a Monday morning?
Well, so now my job has moved on a little bit to also include being a team leader, essentially, and working with people and helping to make the most out of them as a team and as individuals. And that I find very exciting. It means that no day is the same as the next. I have very varied work duties. So again, I like that variety, that I'm not doing the same thing over and over again. And I really like to encourage and develop people. I once heard that the best, someone once told me that the best leaders are the ones who actually create new leaders.
Right.
And so you're not a leader until you've created new leaders, other leaders from your leadership. And that's something that I find quite a challenge for myself to set, to create new leaders and to create new experts in their fields. And yeah, that's something I'm very excited about.
Cool. Yeah, that's so inspiring. So what's the ratio like? You know, because I haven't had the impression that all throughout your academic career you've actually been aware or even held back by the fact that you're female in a very male-dominated industry.
No, certainly not in academia. I have to say that I hardly noticed any form of gender discrimination or that it was an issue at all in academia. My area of physics was quite balanced to start with, and so many of the PhDs around me, etc., were also women. So in academia, that was not an issue at all, I would say.
That's so unusual, isn't it, for physics?
And it's interesting also because obviously I left before I got very senior, so it is quite possible that I would have encountered it later in my career had I continued. But certainly at the sort of junior levels where I was, I didn't notice it.
So even at undergrad level?
No. I mean, I can't say that the ratio was 50-50. It certainly was not that. But I can't say that I felt treated differently, either positively or negatively, for being a woman.
That's so great. I mean, often physics is very heavily male dominated, and you know, I've had a few physicists on this show, and they've talked about kind of feeling very intimidated and shy to participate in class and things like that. Doesn't seem to have affected you in that way.
No, and I guess it comes back a little bit to the fact that I grew up alone with my mother, I think, in that for me, it was perfectly natural that if I had an opinion about something, I was going to say it, and I wasn't shy about it. and and so I was never held back at home. I was never shy in school to say my opinion, and that's continued with me my whole life. That at least there have been no boundaries within myself. No, I've been very happy to just go ahead and do whatever I wanted to do. Um, but it's only now, once I'm in industry, where I do feel a more tangible presence of a certain prejudice.
That's so interesting because definitely what I have noticed about successful women within STEM is their ability to be assertive. So it sounds like you really did develop that skill early on, but now that you're in industry, you're being kind of pushed to your limits with it. Is that true?
Yes, 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 and I guess you have to be. It has to be in your nature a little bit to get through STEM. To at this point anyway, it has to be a bit in your nature to be not shy and to be assertive, as you say, and to not care about what others may think of you, because it will be at times a lonely place to be.
Mm.
So you have to have a little bit of a thick skin, and that is something that I hope with all the events and activities and conversations that are happening in this space, such as this podcast, for example, that with time we can change that. When that fraction of people will approach 50-50, then you can be any type of personality you want, hopefully, and still succeed. But those of us who did this 20, 30 years ago, we needed to have a bit of a thicker skin to get through it.
What kind of challenges are you facing currently?
Well, I mean, there are obvious things like if I go to a meeting with a male colleague, that the people in the room will tend to face my male colleague first and expect that he is the one leading the conversation, even though it may be that that person is junior to me and I'm actually their boss. And then I have to assert myself to show that I'm actually the one that you should mostly be focusing on in this meeting. That happens quite often. People make assumptions on who you are. If you go to a technical event, they might assume that you are there as a recruiter or an assistant or something rather than as an actual scientist. And so there are unfortunately quite tangible events like that, which I never felt in academia.
Right. And so how have you evolved to deal with that?
So one of the things that I did, and I'm not sure whether it's probably one of those things I'm not proud of, and again, I wouldn't necessarily talk very openly about, is that I think I changed how I dress, and I guess I've never dressed in a very girly way to start with, but occasionally I like to have a nice dress on or a nice skirt and top and so on, and I did start to notice that people treated me differently if I was in a dress versus trousers and a cut shirt or something.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so I then basically merged into more and more just wearing more gender neutral clothing, because then I felt that they listened more to what I said rather than judge me from the surface.
Gosh, why do I feel like my heart's breaking at hearing that? I mean, I think the reason why it is heartbreaking is because I really feel like for women to cope in a male-dominated environment, they have to kind of deny their femininity. And I find that so upsetting that we have to pretend to be something we're not. I mean, can't we be in an environment where we're actually celebrating what we as women bring to the table?
Yes, and I think there's other times also. So that's surface, but of course we are also, I think, conforming in our personalities and internally as well. And for example, if you get upset about something in a conversation, it doesn't really matter whether you sort of if you're justified or not in that, because you're often then called out as being emotional, as being either too soft and too sensitive, or being a bitch and being too aggressive. Right. And I think that as women, we walk a very tight rope there of getting the communication with others right. Men have a much wider spectrum where they are forgiven for being one way or the other, whereas as women, we have a very narrow spectrum where we are sort of accepted. Our response is accepted.
So how do you deal with that tightrope?
Yes, that's well, I'm still on the learning curve there, I think.
I mean, there must be examples of where you've kind of regretted what you've done, or you've been extremely proud of the way you've handled things. Like, you know, where are you currently at with it? Because, for example, with me, I just became extremely aggressive. And to the point where I didn't like who I was.
I think my defense mechanism is to basically try to distance myself from those who I feel are judging me in that sense. So if I don't necessarily need to interact with them in the future, I will just ignore them and pretend that it's their loss in some sense, that they don't have me in their network anymore. And I've also, on maybe a slightly comforting side, I have also had individuals in my network who have come back to me 2-3 years later and said, you know what, I dismissed you back then because I thought you were too humble, too naive, too this, too that. But now I realize that I was wrong, and I see that you've been very successful, and therefore I'm sorry, and can we pick it up again? And I then, I feel like you've realized the mistake here, which means that it might help others in the future, and I'm quite happy then to welcome them back into my network.
Yeah, I mean, it's in moments like that where if someone had said that to me, I would actually feel relieved that I continued to be myself, because I think sometimes there's a real tendency for women to change who they are and kind of be like fake it to make it. And when someone actually apologizes and says, you know what, me condemning you for being emotional was a bit harsh, you just think, yes, I had every right to be emotional. And and then it kind of makes you want to just go forward in the future, just allowing yourself to be who you actually are. But it takes a few experiences like that, or just time, to learn that the only way that we can really, it takes time to learn that the only way to be accepted within male-dominated environments is to actually accept ourselves first. And that's like a massive lesson to learn, isn't it?
Yes. And I think it is important to have supportive people around you who you can, when someone says something stupid to you, that you can go to them and you can sense check with them. Like they said that I reacted this way because of that. Do you think that's true or not? And also someone who can sort of pat you on the back and say, you're actually doing a good job. You're not overreacting. You're not this or that. You're doing a good job. And I think that is important. And I think of many of the very successful women I know in the technology industry today are successful because they also have very supportive partners or family or friends who boost them when they need that little extra boost, when they are feeling sad because of what someone said or did to you.
Right. Do you have that?
Yes, I have a very, very supportive husband or who has enabled me to have the career that I wanted to have and that I have been fortunate enough to have. So he supported me both financially and mentally for many years now, and I owe everything to him.
Yeah. What a gift to have met someone like that.
Yes. But I think that's another interesting thing another twist on the gender prejudice thing is that my husband is very happy to be that role of the supportive husband. But of course, growing up for him, that was not what was expected of him. And so when we met and we realized that actually I wanted a career and he was happy to be in my shadow and supporting in some sense, then it was a revelation for both of us because I didn't think men like that existed and he didn't think that women like I existed.
Yeah.
And I think many men actually hesitate to even offer up to doing that role simply because that's not what they think is expected of them.
Yeah. I mean, how did you meet?
Well, we met during our scientific career. So he was also a physicist,
Wow.
and we met within our physics circles. And he actually initially gave up his scientific career for me because as a scientist, you have to go where the jobs are, which means that you have very little choice about where you end up living. And that also means that many scientists struggle, many couples struggle to find a place where they can work and live together.
Yeah.
So he gave up his career first so that he could sort of track me around Europe for my career.
Wow.
And
It sounds like true love.
oh, yes.
I'm always so fascinated about the kinds of partners my Women in STEM guests have because we're such capable, powerful alpha females. And I always wonder what kind of man would suit women like that or women. I mean, I always wonder what kind of partners would suit alpha women like that. Um, what do you think is the secret?
I think it's about being equals on every level, from who does the dishes to ultimately also on an intellectual level. So whereas my husband is very supportive and he's very happy to let my career take precedence over his, he is by no means a dud himself. He has a very good job himself, and he has a career of his own as well. But he's just happy to let me do that because he actually takes pleasure in seeing my career come along as well. What I've also seen is that many women who are in a similar situation to myself, they actually work with their husbands. So they either start their own companies together with their husbands or somehow end up working in the same teams as them, because they are such equals at all level and they trust each other 100%. And there's a loyalty and an understanding, a deep understanding that you can't have with other people in some sense. So I noticed that a lot of couples work together when you have a strong woman, and I think maybe there's some sort of secret to that, but maybe someone should research that and put it in a book.
Yes, yes. I mean, it really, it's, I think the kind of partner we attract um, is actually a really good representation of how we feel about ourselves as individuals. How much you're willing to be supported or have support. I mean, all these kinds of characteristics are a pure reflection of what we feel we deserve, really.
Yes, yes.
And so it's very interesting that you've picked such a good man. I mean, he just sounds so
I
loyal.
guess I was lucky.
Yeah, well, I think luck comes into it as well, but I also think that we are magnetized to um, just people that are a good match, I guess. And one of the things that I have observed about women in STEM is that they have a very strong sense of what they want and what they don't want. Maybe because science is so methodical, um, their approach to relationships can actually be quite methodical.
Yes, that's an interesting observation, which might very well be true. I was also speaking to someone today and we were talking about communication and transparency within teams, and if you are a team leader, how much do you tell your team about what's actually happening, or do you tell them everything, or do you tell them nothing, etc.? And I said to these people, I said, well, if it was me who was in that team, I would want to know everything. I would want to have all the facts, even if they are terrible. And he said, well, you have to remember that that's the scientist in you, and that very few people are that scientific in terms of taking information, whether it's good or bad, and then making a judgment that is not emotional, that is objective based on that information. Whereas the vast majority of people make very emotional decisions and actually would not want to know all the facts if for some reason it would be perceived as negative. And that struck me just today, that there is probably some truth in that. That if you come from a science background, you are used to taking information and without judgment, and then trying to analyze it.
Right. Which just seems so smart to kind of approach life that way. But don't you think?
But it means that we are misunderstood, and we misunderstand others, possibly.
Because everything's intellectualized then.
Yes, because you expect others to make the same sort of rational, judged decisions, but in fact, they don't.
Yeah, because, the approach that you talk about is very intellectual, I think, and very sort of like logical. But life tends to be a lot more messy, doesn't it? And a lot more kind of grey rather than black and white.
Yes, and we rarely have the time in our busy lives to really weigh the pros and cons of every decision we make. We have to go with gut instinct many times, but
and sometimes data is presented to us in a certain way, whereby it's interpreted differently from person to person.
Yes.
As a data scientist, you must come across this a lot, where the data is showing one thing, but you can actually interpret those results one way or another.
Of course, yes. I guess there's an old saying that statistics can prove you anything you want in some sense, and data science is an extension of statistics into the modern era of larger data sets and more computing power. I think the most obvious case is the discussion around the debate around how Brexit happened here in the UK, and I think it's common knowledge now that the Vote Leave side of the campaign used data science very heavily to try to target the voters they wanted to target with the message they wanted those voters to hear. Whereas the Remain campaign were not so active to use data science. And of course, we have the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal and such coming as a result of it. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is a challenge with data science, and there's a debate in our community around the ethical use of data science and how it can be used to influence people. And I think actually that brings back a very important point about diversity as well, because for companies to act ethically, it becomes harder if you have a more diverse team. If everyone looks and thinks the same way, then it's easy for them to sort of maybe stray down the wrong path, because there is no one saying, hey, I'm not sure this is right, we should be doing this.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have a mixed team with mixed backgrounds, experiences, gender, viewpoints, then hopefully someone in there will go, we should really think about whether this is the right thing to do.
Right. So how is it tackled at your place of work?
It's difficult. I think it was actually just last week that the EU, was it EU or UK, who published ethical guidelines for AI. And as I said, I think the most important thing is to keep that debate going around what is right, what should we be doing, what should we not be doing, and again, as I said, just making sure that teams are diverse, and that there is someone that sense checks what you're doing at any time. But it's not an easy question to answer, and I do think that there will always be, unfortunately, groups of people and companies who end up doing the wrong thing. just simply because there's a lack of oversight and control within those companies.
Right. I mean, assuming that you are doing the delightful thing of having diverse teams, does that mean then that your teams are often in conflict?
That's a good question. No, I wouldn't say so. Not necessarily. I mean, of course, what you want to foster is an environment where there is a constructive debate. So, of course, you want everyone within a team to constructively criticize what you're doing at all times, because that's the only way to innovate. That's the only way to grow as a team and to be successful, is to point out where the product you're building is not right, and how you can improve it. Of course, what if, as a team leader, you then need to look into is, or be careful of, is making sure that it is indeed a positive, safe environment where for this constructive criticism, and that it doesn't turn toxic and negative, or bullying type of environment. And that's, again, a difficult line to tread.
This might be a bit of a controversial question, but when you're analyzing data, do you know what result you want before you found it?
Well, as a scientist, we have our scientific method, right? Which is typically that you start with a hypothesis. So a guess. I guess that if my customer buys milk, that they might also like to buy cereal. And then you go out and test it. So you find the data for purchasing behaviors, and then you see, well, are you more likely to buy cereal if you've bought milk? And that's one way to do these types of projects, where you have an idea that you're trying to prove one way or another. There are, of course, other cases where you have no idea what you're after. I also, a little anecdote here as well, which I can talk about because I am anonymous, is that even though data might tell you something, doesn't necessarily mean that the company accepts it as true either. I was at some point working in a bank where we were looking at what factors would affect whether someone would default on their loan or not. And certain factors came out with the unintuitive sign. So let's say, for example, your salary. You would assume that the higher salary you have, the less likely you are to default on your mortgage. But in this case, it wasn't necessarily that particular feature, but let's say it came out the other way around, that more salary would mean more likely to default. When we took that model to the executives of the bank, they just said, well, that's clearly wrong, therefore just throw that out. Throw the data out, because it's wrong. Which is very frustrating, again, for a scientist, because that is what the data tells you. Whether you think it's right or not doesn't come into it, and throwing it out is actually falsifying your results. So, yeah, I lost the start of that question, but it was, I guess the point I was trying to make was that you can, of course, make the data show whatever you want, and sometimes it's accepted and sometimes it's not. And again, it's a little bit up to the integrity of the data scientist to promote what they think is the truth, rather than what the company wants to hear.
And have you seen a distinct difference between men and women's intentions for the science you do?
And what do you mean with intention?
Men and women seem to take a very different approach to things. So, for example, within architecture, women may opt for designs that are more maybe nurturing and more community conscious, or, just different characteristics. Whereas men may want to go, design a building that, shows majesty and power and status and that kind of thing. And, I'm making massively broad sweeping statements here, but I just wondered whether you noticed similar trends within data science between men and women.
It's actually still small number statistics, pardon the pun, in that, unfortunately, there are not that many women in my industry yet. I think the estimate that I've heard is something like 15 to 20% of a relatively young career um, area anyway. So there's not that many women in my industry yet, which is, of course, something that I'm trying to support to increase that number as well in any outreach work I do. But anyway, the point is that I I think we even within data science there are different types of roles you can take. So there are data engineering challenges, which are more around how do we build a database, how do we load our data onto that, how do we manipulate the data on the database. Then there is the machine learning part, which is more around using analytics together with coding. And then, of course, there's a quote unquote softer end of the spectrum where it's about visualizing that data and creating stories around the data, creating insights, communicating that to a wider audience. And definitely, I know for sure that within the data engineering side, so which is really hardcore database work and computer engineering, there are even fewer women in that side. And of course, if we go into more the visualization side, which comes more close to graphic design, etc., there are more women. So yes, even within data science, there is a bit of a range of where people go and how they choose their careers, which I think comes quite natural in the sense that, as I said, you have to have a very thick skin to be the only woman in the team. And therefore, status quo is often maintained that if you tend to have more women in the design department, then other women prefer to work in the design department, and vice versa. So, yeah, it's a problem.
Do you have sort of partners in crime?
Well, in my team, we have a female software developer. We have 2 female data scientists besides myself. We have a female product manager, and we have female executives as well. So I think the company I work in is actually very good with this. And I guess what I think that this company has done well is that they're very focused on diversity. So it's part of the corporate message. It's part of the values of the company. It's part of how they present themselves. They really go through all the communication, both internally and externally, with a sort of fine-tooth comb to figure out, are we in some ways biasing what we're writing here? And that helps. But I can see that it is a relentless piece of work that you cannot relax about it. You have to constantly have diversity at the front of mind.
Yeah. It's also, we're getting to a sort of stage where the genders are becoming more unisex in their outlook. And I just feel with the rise of digital platforms and social media that people are becoming more and more outspoken about their own individual diversity. And so sometimes when I bring up the gender debate, I wonder whether I'm just being really old-fashioned. Things are changing that rapidly.
No, I don't think it's old-fashioned. And we have to also remember that many of us live in the metropoles of the world, in London, for example, or we live in Berlin or Paris, and we are seeing the tip of the iceberg in terms of these sort of issues. I have traveled. I have presented data science in other countries. I have presented in rural Germany, for example, where it is miles away from the gender debate we see in London, places where even homosexuality is considered really a sin, right? So they are way apart from where we feel we are talking about gender fluidity, etc. So I think it will be a long time before the whole world will see gender in such a fluid way. And in the meantime, we need to keep pushing the agenda for women worldwide, because it's a struggle worldwide. And maybe if I can add one thing though that could potentially be a benefit going forward is also remote working. There are more and more opportunities now for everyone to work remotely. So using video tools and chat tools and code sharing, etc. I think that's actually an opportunity for women as well, that they can be more flexible in their working, but yet have great careers where they're not judged by if they're wearing a dress or not, for example.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, on that note about femininity, you mentioned you're married. Where, if anywhere, does kind of maybe motherhood fit into your life? Is that something you've thought about?
Well, it's in the early stages of my career. Obviously, it was not a rush. It was something that could wait, and my career has always been a bit of a baby for me. It was something that was very important to me, and something that both me and my husband treasured in some point, in some sense. And so for now, that's where the focus is. But who knows what the future will bring?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's always so difficult for women, as you know, power women, alpha women, whatever you want to call them, like to really fit everything in.
I think actually there's sometimes you see these profiles of these super women, right, who have amazing careers and they have 5 children and they do pro bono work and this and that. I somehow, I don't know, they're supposed to be role models, but for me they just give me a bad, make me feel guilty for not being able to juggle as much.
I totally agree. And, I often ask on this podcast, what does having it all mean to you? And some women have got quite passionate about it and saying, having it all is just such a myth. It's impossible to have it all. I mean, you can seem as though you have it all, but there's just no way you can have it all at the same time. What are your views on it?
Well, I feel so obviously I have been very driven in my career my whole life. As I said, I decided I was going to become a scientist when I was in my teenage years, and I pursued that, and I was successful in that. And then I decided I wanted a different career, and now I've had that. And so I'm very driven and ambitious, but at the same time, there's a little lazy side in me as well, which would be very happy to just, lazy about a bit at home and potter about a garden and so on and so forth. And one of my teachers once said to me, what if you just try to be content? I thought that's the word. I don't even really know what it means, to be honest. And
Why?
Because there was always something driving or urging me forward my whole life. There was always another rock to climb, essentially, and I'm proud of that. It has made me who I am today. But I have, as I get older now, I realize that the actual challenge in life, I think, is being content, and that doesn't mean that you have to give up or accept second best. Not at all. But finding a place where you are happy and content with your life, whatever that is. And it comes back to knowing who you are, understanding yourself, and finding that contentment. So that's my having it all, finding a place where I'm content with what I have, whatever it may be. I'm not there yet.
That's so beautiful, though. I mean, have you always had a strong sense of self? Because I really do feel like you know yourself well, but has it always been that way, or has it been a journey?
Of course, it's always a journey, but I think, I was a thoughtful child. As I said, I was curious. I was observing things. I was thinking about, as a child already, I was thinking about why do people behave that way or this way, and then, as I think actually many of us do, went through a bit of a depression in my teenage years, which meant that I basically had to understand myself, because otherwise I wouldn't have become healthy again. So through therapy, which was a good way to start that journey of self-understanding, and I think I basically, for the rest of my life since then, I've been trying to understand who I am and what it is that motivates me and what makes me happy.
Yeah. I feel that with this podcast, I am actually moving into the realm of emotional and mental well-being, because you
Mm,
can't really have a successful career or a successful education without taking a look at one's emotional well-being.
mm.
Um, but it's not something we're taught at school.
No, and it's not something we talk about either. And this is one of those things where I feel I wish we could talk more openly about specifically mental health, of course. And I know there's a big drive in society as a whole to talk more about mental health, but certainly when you're in a career and you're a professional woman striving for top positions, there is no way you could admit that you're not feeling well, or that you have panic attacks or you're depressed or whatever it might be. There's no way you could admit it, because it's a weakness and it means that you will be overlooked for that next position. And so we can't talk about it, and we have to pretend that everything's all right. And that's not helpful for ourselves, and it's not helpful for the rest of society either, because it does make it look like we are all perfect. And so
Yeah.
those women who do suffer from these sort of symptoms think, well, I can't make that because I'm not like that. Um,
Mm.
yes, and we do suffer from a lot of stress and pressure, I think. So I think there are a lot
Yeah.
of women, professional women, who suffer in silence.
Mm. Hence this podcast.
Mm.
I mean, I wonder what the world would look like if we were able to talk about it. I mean, I can't imagine it, because the way we have, I mean, this podcast is anonymous. When people do talk about their emotional well-being, it's always like this big revelation.
Mm.
I mean, I just can't imagine what it would be like in a corporate world to be having these conversations. Can you?
No, no, I can't. And yeah, I recently, so I've suffered from a bit of bad health myself throughout the times, and at times I wasn't sure whether the symptoms I was feeling were actually because of a physical condition, or somehow psychosomatic from the pressure and stress I was feeling.
Mm.
And I found myself really, really wishing that it was something physical, because if I had to go to my boss and say, well, I need to take time off because I have illness X, they would
Yeah,
go, oh, I'm so sorry. I hope you get better soon. Need any support you need, take the time off.
yeah.
And if you go and say, I need to take time off because I'm depressed, it's a very different reaction. And again,
Mm.
there's a stigma that follows that, even if you were to come back to work after a period of time off. So,
What's actually amazing is the number of women who are fully functioning at work, not just women, men as well,
mhm.
who are fully functioning at work, but actually, look back on those times where they were juggling or spinning so many plates and saying, yeah, I was really depressed during that time, but it was actually work that
Mm.
covered it all up because
Yeah,
I just kept busy.
yeah. Yes, I think it's true, and I think that's when people get very hurt and very ill, when they continue then to push on and pretend like everything's fine, and bottle it up until they reach breaking point.
Mm.
So yeah, it's a conundrum. I don't know. I would never go out and openly admit that I have depressions, because I would worry what it does to my career. However, I wish we could all do it. I
Yeah,
wish there would be a day of amnesty for everyone to go on that day. You know what? I don't feel well.
they could just get honest.
Yes.
Yeah, and tell it how it is.
Mm.
Oh my God, that would just be so freeing. You mentioned right at the beginning of this podcast that you really love what you do, and I must say that when I heard the passion in your voice. It was kind of infectious. I'm so curious about data science now. It just sounds really, really awesome and interesting and revealing.
It is.
What advice would you give to anyone who, has had their curiosity sparked about this scientific field?
Well, so in terms of data science, it's a field of where there's a lot of interest, and the good thing about that means that there are enormous amounts of fantastic resources free on the web for anyone who's interested. So if anyone's interested, first thing you go is Google and start searching around. If you have a bit more time and you want to get more into it, there's plenty of fantastic free online courses. So places like Coursera or edX, or other of these sort of MOOC courses, they have all of them have introductory courses to data science to follow, and they tend to be generally free as well. So it's just your time that's needed to get up to speed with it. But yeah, I would just suggest Googling around, reading about case studies, about how it works, about what a career in data science is like, and get stuck in, because it's so easy to get started. Anyone can do it, absolutely anyone, I promise. Just depends on how much motivation and how much time you have, and just do it.
Yeah, and is the money good? I know it's a terrible question to ask, but
well, there was a time when Harvard Business Review called data science the sexiest job of the 21st century. And part of that was salary. I think salaries now are coming down a little bit, but a starting salary, yes, because it is becoming very popular. So starting salaries in London, I would say, are around £40,000 a year mark. But as you become more senior, the really top people in this industry are earning £100,000 plus a year. So it's still a very, very good career, and it's a career that's where the demand is just going to keep growing. So there will always be jobs for those who are interested in this.
Well, thank you so much for introducing me to a world that I don't really know that much about, but I'm sure I've reaped the benefits of the work that you do, even if it's just me being on Facebook or something. Like, I think we're very affected by the work that you do as data scientists. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you very much for having me, and I hope that the sharing my thoughts can help someone else as well.
I'm sure it will. That's it from my STEM guest this week. Gosh, what a fascinating area of work. It's not something I've ever really thought of, but I think it really does affect my life, your life, everybody's lives as we navigate through this digital era where so much data is being generated and processed so that we can get a better understanding of who we are as human beings. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to rate and review the show, and catch you next week on Silence.